All right, thanks, Alex. Yeah, thanks, everybody. Like our previous two presenters, I've kind of had a long-standing interest in the relationship between landscape and pictorial views of place and planner or cartographic views of place, and how those two kind of come into conversation with one another. So just a quick cheers to the NACIS organizing committee for reading deeply in between the lines of our abstracts and bringing us together. I don't know if I could have done that, so nice work. Yes, my name again is Nick Bauch. My background's in cultural geography, and just to give you a little context of where I'm coming from. But in my talk today, I want to discuss the visual design or visual graphic design implications of what happens when we merge the work of an information theorist with the work of a spatial theorist, and see where that might leave us as cartographers. So it's going to be some theory stuff and then example stuff. Okay, so in her 2014 book called Graphicis, there's an information studies scholar, some of you may know, called, her name's Johanna Drucker, and she defines this term graphicis like this: the study of visual production of knowledge. Graphicis, it describes ways of graphical formats embody semantic value in their organization and structures, end quote. So this evocatively suggests to me that meaning is communicated not only through specific design elements, like the typeface and line weights, for example, here, expertly achieved by David Imus, but also she's saying through a more basic, more hidden set of assumptions about visual communication. So Drucker, she's saying that yes, line weight and typeface are capable of communicating in the first place because they're part of this underlying structure of visual communication. So just as at one register, particular graphic elements can change meaning in different times and places, so too at a different register can this underlying structure of visual communication that she's trying to allude to. Okay, so on the one hand, this type of insight that she's making is pretty far removed from immediate practical cartography. It's helpful, for example, to operate in a shared cartographic paradigm where the graphic language of maps communicates by way of its shared semantics. So without the map maker telling me, I know that a line is probably a boundary or a path or a connecting or movement agent of some sort. The map reader hopefully does not need to discuss this with the map maker each time a new map is encountered. But on the other hand, I think Drucker's critique or observation could have practical effects too for doing cartography. So one of the main challenges that I face in cultural geography is how to interpret this. There's this idea of multiple spaces, right? And how do you interpret this idea of there being many different spaces in light of present-day cartographic practice? So this is a question, to me at least, of how does spatial theory meet graphic design? So I want to describe this challenge a little more in terms of a paradox. With the techniques of digital cartography, as we've seen this week, and as many of us know, we're able to map a seemingly infinite number of things that before were not able to be mapped. This is, in some ways, thanks to what I think of as kind of the fine-tuning of the data to grid cartographic model. On the other side of the paradox, one of the main contributions of spatial theory over the past 30 or so years has really been recognizing that space itself is built from all kinds of social and economic activities among people and the world that they live in. And so when I say space itself, this to me is the key point. The interactions that people have with their surroundings and with each other cannot be visualized fully when they are, I think, as Drucker might put it, when they're kind of trapped in a particular graphic format. And this is what she's trying to query or get into. So the kind of cultural geographer in me, the hunch is that there's other geographies going on in addition to these kind of direct locational translations to the map. And I think certainly Dylan and others that already today, we've seen examples of that. Okay, so one of the founding voices of this hunch, as I called it, is Henri Lefebvre, who argued for this multiplicity of spaces that emerge. They could emerge quickly in real time from various sets of things going on, and after they emerge, they might stay around for a while or they might disappear. It depends on what space emerges. To give some examples, by the early 2000s, geographers began detailing all kinds of spaces, spaces of affect, queer spaces, post-colonial spaces, capital, spaces of capital, to name a few. And this idea of space emerging, coming and going, has really caught on in that field. So each of these spaces is produced, as Lefebvre says it, through this unique coming together of elements. Okay, so there's no doubt that we can find things to datify and to put on maps for each one of these, for example, for each one of these spaces. And I want to be clear that doing so, I think this opens up often new ways of seeing and understanding, and this is no small feat. So for example, here is Darrell Williams' project. That he uses cartography to learn about the urban geography of 19th century former slaves in Rio de Janeiro. Well, this is undoubtedly a different type of space, or a different city, so to speak, that is made by how the free slaves interact with one another, how they interact with their built environment, other economic actors, and so on. And I think we would all say we find great benefit in this type of rethinking urban space at this time in Rio. My own motivation, it's a little bit different than this, though. I'm trying to go back, I think, to the roots of Lefebvre's idea about many spaces, and to look at that from Drucker's perspective. So what happens if we assume from the start that these different spaces each deserve their own graphic form?
Sorry about that.
Oh, that's all right.
I can kill that.
I'll talk quick.
Jesus. Sorry about that.
No, that's all right. Yeah.
Everybody gets to see my calendar.
Sure do that. Oh, cool. Thanks, Alex. Yeah, so the idea is if we go back to the kind of root of Lefebvre's idea that there's these many spaces going on, and then wed that to what Drucker is trying to say, could it be that each one of these spaces deserves its own entire graphic form, in certain cases at least, or their own spatial visual language? So Lefebvre is on the right here, many spaces. Drucker is on the left here. Each one of these maybe would benefit from having a different visual graphic language. So I think this is a cartographic problem. This notion of space coming together with a visual language. I also think it's a design challenge, right? It draws us necessarily away from the semantic structure of some of the inherited norms of cartography. And so notice, to bring the point home, that this is a textual, theoretical slide, not a series of images or design types yet. And I'm proposing that this is partly because we don't have a codified way of talking about this. We have examples, people have done work, but we don't have kind of graphic languages built up for this in the same way that we do for other types of map making. So the cartographic model of the data to grid is one of Drucker's structures that we could, I think, again, really kind of question if our motivation is to visually visually clarify Lefebvre. Okay, so this summer I began a project using the Mojave Desert as a case study, seeking to try to address this exact issue. And the founding idea is to make a type of atlas that brings together, again, Lefebvre with Drucker, this critique of many spaces with the idea of graphices. And so for those who don't know about this region, it sits kind of right between Las Vegas and Los Angeles. This boundary of the Mojave Desert that you kind of see outlined here is from these two ecologists, Rundle and Gibson. There are many dozens of ideas of where the Mojave actually is supposed to be. I liked their description. They used precipitation, elevation, vegetation to sort of discern what actually makes it distinctive from the other surrounding deserts. So I decided, I'm like, okay, venturing into new territory, what am I going to do? And actually, a lot like Dylan, I kind of started with a camera. I decided I wanted to approach this design problem with this visual technology that has also deep roots in geographical expression, namely photography. And I wanted to take pictures and then embed them with programmed video screens and try to create this the graphic representation of space, basically. This is the back of a 20 by 24 inch fine art photographic print. It's mounted on dye bond, which is an aluminum material. It's got these wooden cleats. So this is a Raspberry Pi in the sort of center of the screen. Right there. It's a mini CPU connected to a 3 by 5 inch screen programmed to loop video when powered on. So I got hooked on the idea of studying, with this kind of framework somewhere in my mind. I started studying water springs in the Mojave when I found this description from a 1921 USGS report. This book is like 750 pages long. In this guy, he describes by text and by these mile markers on the left how to get to all the springs in the desert. The book is called Routes to Desert Watering Places in the Mojave Desert. 750 pages later, you may or may not have water. Water, it seems like an obvious place to start in a desert. Its presence and absence have a lot to do with the human history that one can find in this region. So my method was to use these historical documents and others like them to travel and try to go to these places and see what was there. Was there actually water? Was there evidence of water? How can you start learning to read the landscape for where water might be? And the point of this really was not only or necessarily to ground truth locational accuracy for like a water atlas, but to use the process to start thinking through kind of how I introduced the talk. Like how do you start building different graphic languages? So I'm trying to use this process to think, well, what are the things that we do need to think about in alternative, let's call it, cartographic representations. So interpretation-based cultural geography, there we go. Interpretation-based cultural geography draws connections between a landscape scene, that which lies before you, and the distant or even global processes that make that scene possible. And you're seeing sort of the process here of what I went through to do this embedding of the photographic prints with a video screen. So what if you're using the landscape scene to interpret spatial movement around the globe, what are the other places, people, institutions that sort of unconsciously give rise to this landscape scene that you're looking at? The scene itself so often seems inconsequential or natural or removed from time or even uninteresting. But the landscape scene is, I think, the interpreter's foothold onto the world. And one way of being geographically is to ask about the making of scenes encountered in the movement of everyday life. So hiking through, look at in this scene, I'm like, well, this is a boring looking pile of rocks, but let me see if I can make something of this. All right, 1 second. There we go. Sorry. All right, so in this photo video prototype called mine tailings, for example, these white rocks are part of this enormous pile of leftover material from the Giant Ledge mine. So long since abandoned, the mine remnants sit next to this spring, which is what brought me to the place. But what were these prospectors pulling out of the ground here? Where did their efforts show up in other human activities around the globe? So what, in other words, are the connections between this pile of innocent enough looking rocks that one might encounter today on a hike and the making of the modern world? Well, it turns out that one of the elements extracted from this exact mine is called scheelite tungsten, one use of which is to make glow-in-the-dark radium paint. And a primary use of this paint was for World War airplane panel instruments, so you could see them in the dark. But making the paint caused harm to the laborers, most of whom were women, setting off a workers' rights campaign. Decades later, outlined, there's a book called The Radium Girls that came out last year that really outlines this. So connecting this story to a water springs atlas of the Mojave Desert it's like a prototype example of how I imagine one could go about detailing the produced space of water in the Mojave Desert. Okay. Water also brought me to this place, Coyote Springs, where I encountered these abandoned water tanks. They're called guzzers colloquially, from a failed cattle operation decades ago. And while these prototypes they're photographic and videographic in nature, I understand that these aren't straight maps, right? And I'm moving towards thinking about how to use these to integrate with cartography more explicitly. But I'm using these, and I'm interested in using this to start developing a more robust sort of visual typology. And I just kind of want to close by saying at the lab that I direct, the Experimental Geography Studio, we have grad students, undergrads, faculty from our campus and beyond, working on all kinds of different media. Alex, I think, kind of mentioned in the intro, who are working to tackle this problem and problems related to it, of how these different types of spatial relationships become represented and communicated visually. So it's that visual graphic forms of visual graphicis in geography that I'm really interested. And let me just in closing, for the next couple minutes or whatever, while we're changing people, I just wanted to pass around this book that I made that goes in conjunction with this. Exhibit. So thanks a lot for listening. I really appreciate it. And I love being at NACIS, so thanks a lot.